Okay.
All right, everybody, this is a unique interview today. I have the pleasure of interviewing my soon-to-be good friend, I hope, Terry Cadenbach, if I butcher your last name, sir.
Cadenbach, yeah.
Who worked with MACVSOG in the latter part of the war. But we're going to get into some early stuff. So, Terry, when and where were you born?
I was born in St. Louis, 1948, and grew up in St. Louis basically my whole life, and graduated from high school out in the county of, St. Louis is, you got a city and you've got a county also called St. Louis County. And it's made up of like 90 some odd municipalities. So I graduated from high school out in the county in 1966.
Now, with graduating in 66, the war had been declaratively going on for 2 years. So what did you know about Vietnam in 1966?
Very little, except there was a war going on. And if you got, what was it, Time magazine or something, you'd see articles telling, and you got to keep in mind that back then the news media was more focused on, let's tell everybody about all the casualties in that so they'll be against the war. So me growing up the way I did, like I wrestled in high school, I was undefeated 2 years in a row, and my nickname was Superman. So going into the military kind of was just part of my natural growing up progression. I was not ready at all to go to college or anything else like that. I was too busy drinking and chasing girls, and sooner or later I was going to get in trouble if I didn't do something with my life. So one day my mom and I got into it like we did frequently, and she's like, well, why don't you just join the Army and go to Vietnam? So that afternoon I went down and signed up, came home and said, I need a ride to the Mart building, which was the big building in St. Louis where they did inductions. Monday morning, I got to be there at 8 o'clock. Well, what are you doing there? And I said, well, I'm joining the Army. Well, I didn't mean it. Well, too bad. That's what I want to do. And of course, I got lied to by the recruiter. I told him I wanted to be in a combat arms and eventually get into special forces. And when I got out of basic training at Fort Leonard Wood here in central Missouri, I got orders for the quartermaster school at Fort Lee, Virginia, which is not what I wanted. I'm not going to be a supply clerk. I wanted to be a war hero. So I ended up having to do all that, and I got assigned there at Fort Lee. And at the in December of 67, so I went in the Army in December of 66. So in December of 67, I saw a sign that there was a special forces recruiter on base. So I went and talked to him. I did the thing, signed on a dotted line. Next thing I know, they told me I couldn't go to jump school because I wore glasses. Well, next thing I know, I got orders for jump school and special forces. So
how'd you find jump school, by the way? I love talking to guys who went to jump school.
Well, it's only 3 weeks long. And in the second week, we were out doing our 10-mile run after breakfast. Jonh Wayne was filming the movie The Green Berets down at Fort Benning, Georgia, where jump school was.
Wow.
Outside of the fort and all that. So we're out there doing our 10-mile run after breakfast, and they bring us up off the track and tell us to get in the bleachers. Well, it turned out that Jonh Wayne had about a 2-hour break between two scenes. So he told him, he says, I want to talk to these guys. And even the Army couldn't say no to him, And so we spent 2 hours sitting in the bleachers talking to him and visiting, and that was awesome. That was like a highlight. And they used us in the movie. They used us as background in the one scene.
That's awesome.
So I can pick myself out, in that. So that was pretty cool.
Well, I'm sure being a product of the 50s and 60s, you saw plenty of Jonh Wayne movies too, as well.
Well, yeah, that's, and, we didn't have horses when I was a kid, and I always wanted to you know, have horses and be a cowboy and all that kind of stuff. And I did later, but, so yeah, getting to meet him. And then here I am at jump school getting ready to go be a Green Beret, and he's doing the movie, The Green Berets. And so it was just really, really a highlight. And I've done a lot of movies, but that was the highlight for me of all of them is, you know, meeting him. So then the last week of jump school, you got to make 5 jumps and you have to march, you have to go to graduation. So if you get hurt and they have to haul you away in an ambulance or something, you ain't graduating. And then once you heal up, they'll recycle you through to try again. Well, there was something called a thermal inversion, which I was probably 50 feet off the ground on my last jump coming down. And a friend of mine who was an instructor at the jump school said they had an average of 3 to 5 people a week get this same injury. And what happened is instead of coming in at an angle and drifting in, something happened with the air current and we dropped straight down. So when I dropped, my feet hit the ground, my butt hit the ground. I heard some pops. I lay there for a minute. I've managed to hobble to my feet, and there's a doctor standing 20 feet from me. They had actually doctors standing on the drop zone because there were so many injuries. And he looked at me and he said, well, if you can get up, you're okay. Right. I shattered my right ankle. From lifting weights, they said my ligaments were so strong that where the ligaments fuse into the ankle bone, it just ripped the bones apart. And I broke my back.
Wow.
You got to have the drive. You got to be determined. I hobbled to graduation and I graduated. And then I got down to Fort Bragg and, well, I went on sick call the next day. And they said, we've already sent your records to Fort Bragg, so you wait till you get down there, go see a doctor. Well, I got down there and, you know, it's like, I want to make it through training. And so that would have been, jump school was the first 3 weeks of January. So the last week of January, I get down to Fort Bragg, start my training, and, you know, I made a few more jumps and yeah, it hurt, but I figured if I can tough it out, you know, Superman, unless you got kryptonite, Superman can do whatever he wants. So well, at the end of March, we get paid, we're getting paid on a Friday. So in the Army, when you're getting paid like that, it's a day off. So you can go pay your bills and all that stuff. Well, my plan was to hitchhike up to Washington, D.C. from Fort Bragg, which is, I think, 300 miles or something, and fly home on standby, so it'd be half price, get my car and bring it back all in a weekend. You know, it was a 1,000-mile drive from St. Louis to Fort Bragg.
Good.
So I was scheduled for a jump on Saturday. So I went to the doctor on Thursday. They x-rayed me and he says, well, you shattered your ankle, but it looks like it's healing on its own. So we're just going to leave it alone, not do anything with it. And I said, Doc, I'm supposed to jump on Saturday. Can I at least have a couple of days? Because I had heard it playing touch football after class one night. He said, I'll give you a note. So he gives me a note to get me out of the jump. So I flew home Friday, got my car, swung down through Alabama, picked up another guy, and we got to Fort Bragg at like 4 o'clock Monday morning, just in time to get up at 5, you know, for training. So I was trained in weapons. So what it was back then was you spent 4 weeks in what we called phase 1. Then you go off to your individual MOS training. Like for me, it was weapons. So you had a light weapons for 8 weeks and then heavy weapons for 8 weeks. And then you go to what we call back then, they called phase 2, where you do some additional classes and then you parachute into the mountains in North Carolina up in the Pisgah National Forest. and up around Troy.
Oh, yes, sir.
Okay. And you play war for, I think it was 12 days. And it was really cool because the civilians up there get involved in it and help you. Like my team, one night we stop at this farmhouse. They brought us in, they washed all our clothes, they provided us a home cooked meal. You know, and there's like 12 of us, you know, and it was just as cool as could be. We had heard rumors about some super secret thing going on in Vietnam, and nobody would talk about it. And one night after class, we asked our instructor, because he had been to Vietnam, what's this deal we keep hearing about? He says, it's so secret, I can't talk about it. He says, I know, because I was there, but he says, I can't say anything because you sign a 20-year non-disclosure, and if you get caught talking about it, you go to Leavenworth for 20 years. Okay, he says, wait till you get there and then you'll find out. So during this time period, there was a lady in the Pentagon named Billye Alexander, and Mrs. A, we called her, and it was a known fact that anybody in Special Forces, she handled all the assignments worldwide for Special Forces. So if you wanted to go somewhere in particular, you just get a hold of her. So a bunch of us got together and we sent a dozen roses to her at the Pentagon. And here's a list of our names, ranks, serial numbers, and we all want to volunteer for Vietnam. So we graduated from training group at the end of August. We're now officially Green Berets, and we got to get our assignments. And all 11 of us got our orders for Vietnam, which we just, you know, and you got to think, we're all like 19, 20 years old. We're like, we've been drinking the Kool-Aid and we know we're the baddest dudes in the valley, and we're ready to go. So you go home on leave for 30 days and then you catch a commercial flight and you go to Fort Lewis, Washington, and you get in there. And we get there and they said, well, it's going to be about 3 days before your flight to Vietnam. And you're going to end up, you're going to do KP duty, you know, and cleanups. And it's like, no. So the 11 of us, we caught a Trailways bus and we went into downtown Seattle and we partied for 3 days. And there's stories about that probably better left untold. But we came back, we got our flight, didn't get in any trouble or anything. We got our, I mean, what are they going to do? Send you to Vietnam? We're already going. And that was our attitude. So we get to Vietnam, we go into Cam Ranh Bay, which is further south, and it's right on the ocean in a huge airport. Well, that's where all your incoming troops would go and get processed to be sent. And we all had orders then sending us on to 5th Special Forces Group. If we didn't have orders saying that, we could have got assigned anywhere, but we all had the orders. So we go to 5th Special Group headquarters at Nha Trang, which is also on the coast of the South China Sea. So we get there and you spend a week, we spent a week filling sandbags, and they said that was to get us accustomed to the heat. And there's some truth to that. I mean, it's, you know, when you get off the airplane at Cam Ranh Bay and it's 120 degrees out there on the tarmac, you got to get used to that heat. And
I've had a lot of Marines tell me too, you have to get used to the smell. The smell of Vietnam is different too.
Well, the smell is like garbage. It smells like garbage, a combination of garbage and diesel fumes from all the aircraft and all that. And so we get to 5th Group. We filled sandbags for a week. Then they send us out on this island called Han Tre Island for some additional in-country training, patrolling, and I got picked to demonstrate the McGuire rig, which was a rig that the helicopters would drop where you get into it and they can pull you up out of the 100-foot long rope. They can pull you up out of the jungle from an area where a chopper couldn't land. But we spend a week patrolling and learning all this other stuff. We go back, and then the sergeant major comes in. He gets us all in this room, and he says, I'm going to give you guys a once in a lifetime opportunity. He says, I can't tell you what it is. All I can guarantee you is you'll see plenty of action and you'll either be killed or wounded. So if you want to volunteer, raise your hand. So 9 out of the 11 of us raised our hand. The other guys, you're free to go. We'll get with you later. So they cut orders for us. And at that time, there were several what we called FOBs, forward operating bases, in Vietnam. Myself and some of the other guys, we all got sent to Da Nang, which is way north on the coast. And that was called FOB at that time. I think it was called FOB 4. So we get there, they put us in a room, and there's a curtain on one wall, and we could kind of see behind it that there was a map on the wall. So the sergeant major and the colonel come in and they say, well, you guys have volunteered. I'm going to give you a chance to back out. Nobody backed out. So he said, before we can tell you what you volunteered for, you need to sign a non-disclosure agreement. And it's 20 years, you won't talk about it. And if you do, you get 20 years in Leavenworth in prison. Okay, fine. So we signed the paper. He pulls the map back, and it's a map of mostly of Laos, North Vietnam, and Cambodia. And he says, you're in an organization called MACVSOG. So now's probably a good time to explain what SOG is.
Take it away.
In 1965, there were different projects over there doing different things. The CIA was in Laos. There was a special forces operation in Laos at one time called White Star. But they formed this thing, and it had a name, and some reporter got a hold of the name. And so they then changed it to MACVSOG, which stood for Military Assistance Command Vietnam, which was the highest headquarters in Vietnam. And they controlled everything. And then SOG, and that stood for Studies and Observation Group. And that was to throw the reporters off. If somebody got wind of it, well, studies and observation, that means that they're studying maps or they're whatever they're doing, but it wouldn't tell what it really was. So what SOG really was, there were different branches. There was one Op 35, Op 34, there was Op 35, Op 36. One of them involved training Vietnamese soldiers, and they would take them up off the coast of North Vietnam and let them infiltrate and supposed to gather intelligence, all that. Not a single team ever came back.
I was about to ask that.
Then so what we were doing was called Op 35, and that was going into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam to gather intelligence, because the North Vietnamese were not supposed to be in Laos and Cambodia and all that, but they were, and we knew they were. So our project was broken down to two things. There were recon teams, which were made up of 2 or 3 Americans and anywhere from 5 or 6 indigenous troops. They could have been Chinese Nungs, mercenaries. They could have been Montagnards, which were the hill people, whatever. And then there were 2 groups. There was the recon teams, which were the small 6 to 9 man teams, and their job was purely reconnaissance. It was not to go in and play shoot 'em up or anything. They were to go in and, like, for instance, observe the Ho Chi Minh Trail, maybe count vehicles, whatever, try to locate, maybe they find say a regimental base camp, which could have been 1,200 men. Then they'd come out hopefully undetected, which very rarely happened. And then let's say, for instance, like when I got shot the first time, a recon team had gone in and found what appeared to be a truck park where the North Vietnamese trucks would come down and they'd stop there to refuel and maybe get a meal and what have you. Well, that was too much for a 8 or 9 man recon team to handle. So they then put together a mission for the Hatchet Force. The Hatchet Force, there were two where I went at Khartoum, there were 2 companies, Company A and Company B. So the company was a total of about 105 men. There was a captain and a lieutenant in command. Then there were 3 platoons, which usually had either like a lieutenant or a senior NCO. And then each platoon had 3 squads. So I was a squad leader in one of the squads. And each squad was about 8 guys and an American. So all told, in a company, there was roughly about 105 men. So we went in and took care of this truck park. And I'll get to that more in detail later. So they said, they gave us our orders of which camp we were going to be sent to. And mine was for Khartoum, which was, at that time, it was called CCN, Command and Control North, FOB2. A couple of months later, they changed it all up, and you had CCN out of Da Nang, CCC at Khartoum, where I was at, or Command and Control Central. And then you had Command and Control South, further south at Bambi Tuit. CCS at Bambi Tuit, they strictly operated in Cambodia. CCC, where I was at, we were located at Khartoum, which was right on the tri-border of Laos, Cambodia, and South Vietnam, where those 3 borders joined. And we were maybe, 20 miles from the border. So and then out of Da Nang, they did their thing, which was further north in North Vietnam, and there were a few operations into North Vietnam, but mostly in Laos. So I got orders for Khartoum. So I go to Khartoum, and I know I've heard some guys talk about they were given a choice. Do you want to go to recon or do you want to go to the Hatchet Force? I wasn't given a choice, and it turned out it was because the Hatchet Force had taken so many casualties in the previous couple of months. So they said, well, you're going Hatchet Force. I had no idea what that was. And they said, well, they'll tell you when you get there. So they had me go draw all my gear, and the supply sergeant, I knew nothing, of course, I didn't know anybody at that time. I'm one of the FNGs, the new guys. And this guy seemed to know what he was talking about. And he said, you can carry whatever weapon you want. We've got them all. You just tell me what you want, but I would recommend this, and whatever. Little did I know that this guy's name was Bob Howard, and he had already been put in for 2 Congressional Medals of Honor at that point. And both of them had been downgraded to Distinguished Service Crosses.
Why that? Why the downgrade?
Politics, I think, because the high command in Saigon, they didn't like special forces to start with. So anyway, I draw all my gear. They send a Jeep for me, and Company B of the Hatchet Force was located at what they called the Yard Camp. It had been an old A-team camp about 3 or 4 miles south of the main FOB. And that's all it was our one company of the Hatchet Force and a security company. So they send me up there and they get me settled in, and, we start training. And so that's how I got into SOG. And then we kind of went from there.
Well, I wanted to touch on the training that you did in country with Hatchet Force. How did they train in country from the yard camp?
Behind the yard camp was a range, a rifle, whatever range. You could blow stuff up or whatever. So we spent an awful lot of our time down there practicing what we called immediate action drills. For instance, we're on a patrol in Laos and we're going along a trail and all of a sudden we make contact, whether it was because we got ambushed or because we spotted enemy soldiers coming towards us or whatever. So we just spent hours on end doing these, what we called immediate action drills. Okay, how are you going to react if this happens? And we tried to cover as many different scenarios as we could. Some of these Montagnards of ours had been we had a couple of old guys that had actually fought with the French.
Wow.
In we had one guy that had been at Dien Bien Phu and he was able to get away from there before, So, and then we had guys, Montagnards that were 15 years old and they've been fighting the Viet Cong or whatever since they're 12 or 13. The ethnic Vietnamese people hated the Montagnards. They called them Moi, M-O-I, which kind of meant savages. And I guess the best comparison I can give would be the Montagnards over there would be the equivalent of the American Indians over here. And the ethnic Vietnamese hated them. They treated them like dirt. They just really were bad to them. But they worked for us, and they were the most loyal people you'd ever know. One of our soldiers, just a private, one of our soldiers was making as much money per month as a lieutenant in the Vietnamese army.
Wow. That's a big difference, and that's a reason to support.
Oh, yeah, that's a reason to be loyal.
Absolutely.
So, we in a nutshell, we loved our yards. We did a lot of things for them off the books. We took good care of them.
And they fought damn well too, from what I've heard.
And they fought well. And because a lot of them had prior combat experience, when you go out to the field with them, you listen to them. If there's bad guys around, number one, the yards could smell them partly because of the diet that they had.
Go into that.
Yeah. Well, one of the big food things over there was what's called nukmam, which was rice, and nukmam was basically fermented fish heads. Gross, but it stunk to high heaven. And so these North Vietnamese, number one, they're marching all the way down from North Vietnam down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They ain't had a bath in God knows how long. They stink to high heaven. And then their diet would cause their body, when they perspire, to put off odors, which could be smelled. The yards were just really good at that. So you learn to rely on the yards. And if the yards say Buku VC or Buku NVA, which means very many NVA, you listen to them and you stop and you assess the situation. I used to teach my yards English at night when we weren't out in the field, and they would teach me some of their dialects because there was a bunch, kind of like the American Indians had tribes. The yards had basically the same thing. And we had a mixture of a whole bunch of different, and they all had different dialects, their languages. So I just felt like it was really important when you go to the woods that your soldiers, if you're given a command in a tense situation, that they understand what you're wanting them to do, instead of always having to rely on your interpreter to interpret what I'm saying. And it was also, I thought it was important for me to understand them, because if they say something about enemy or, whatever, it's nice, again, from a standpoint of time, it's faster if I understand what they're saying than them telling the interpreter and the interpreter telling me. So, you know, and I'll have to admit, I had a Montagnard girlfriend the whole time I was over there. Well, actually, I had a couple of them.
I was about to
But
ask.
there
Jason
was
told
something
me to
about
ask that.
the blue eyes that they were just fascinated with, and I was fairly popular, which I didn't complain, you know. But so our training, the majority of our training was back there on that range. The yards, and a good example, the yards were notorious. They didn't know what baseball was, number one.
Oh boy.
So to throw a baseball overhanded, they had no idea how to do that.
That had to be comical.
Well, yeah, but it was also dangerous because they didn't know what they were doing. There was a number of instances where they'd go to throw a grenade and they'd come back like this and the grenade would keep going out of their hand because they weren't holding on to it tightly. Well, then everybody's got to scramble and duck and hopefully nobody gets hurt. And so we finally figured out that although they were not worth the damn throwing overhanded, they could toss underhanded like a softball. So we started training with them to throw underhanded. And that worked out okay. Still not the best, but you know. But marksmanship was a big deal. And of course, we had a range. And so, you know, throwing grenades, shooting your rifle in a controlled manner. Just because you had a 20-round clip and you could fire it on full auto, you don't want to waste all your ammo by just cutting loose with a big burst, although that's what seemed to happen more often than not. And then practicing those immediate action drills, those were the main things. Every story that I can tell, if you talk to a guy that ran recon rather than being in the Hatchet force, his stories are going to be somewhat different because, number one, it was a lot more what's the right word? Crucial anyway, for them to maintain silence. Whereas a Hatchet force, it became known in early '69 that there was a mole in Saigon at SOG headquarters. And they did not do a good job of trying to find out who this mole was, but he was an NVA colonel who actually was also in the Vietnamese army, and he was assigned to SOG headquarters. Well, every time a mission came down from the White House, or some of our missions had to actually be approved by the president. Some of them, probably the majority of them, were approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But all that information, when it came back to SOG headquarters in Saigon, this mole was turning around and he would send coordinates of our LZs. He would send even names of us Americans, the name of the team, all that stuff, when we're going to go in, what day, what time, all that stuff. And it got to be that every time we put a team in, they were waiting on us. So if you were able to escape off the LZ and lose your pursuers, that's what a recon team, that was crucial for them. In the Hatchet force, okay, now there's 105 of us, a whole company. You know, you don't want to make all the noise in the world, but there's no way you're going to land with choppers. You're going to land 105 guys when you can only get 5 or 6 guys at a time on a chopper. I mean, it's a half a day thing trying to get everybody in and on the ground. And a lot of times what the North Vietnamese would do is they'd wait till a team was on the ground, and then their big thing was to try to shoot the choppers down. And whenever we put a team in, we always had air support. You had Huey gunships that were the Charlie model, UH-1, C, which is the Charlie model gunships. You had the Cobra gunships. And then we had our, it sounds kind of funny in the 60s, but we had these old Korean War vintage piston driven A1 Sky Raiders.
Love this.
They were propeller driven, but what was so great about them, they could carry twice the weight of the aircraft in armament. I mean, these guys could load to the gills, and they could stay, because you got to remember, we're traveling from South Vietnam into as much as maybe 20 miles into Laos. So fuel was always an issue. These A1s could stay what we called on station. They could stay nearby for up to 4 hours before they would have to leave and go refuel. So we loved them. And some of these pilots, they were just, oh man. You know, if you can imagine, the guy slides the cockpit dat and he's flying over, firing his 38 pistol out the thing because he's out of armament and we're in danger of being overrun. So we had a variety of aircraft. Now, if you went north to CCN into the more northern part of Laos, they a lot of times got put in on their missions by Air Force or Marine Corps helicopters. And some of those choppers could hold more than the 5 or 6. We also had these old Korean War vintage Sikorsky H-34s. They were painted black and green with no markings, and they'd hold 5 or 6 guys. And they were flown by Vietnamese Air Force pilots. These guys, contrary to a lot of other things that I could say about the Vietnamese Army in general, these guys all came from, I guess what you'd call well-to-do families, and they went to the military academy and became pilots. These guys, there was nobody that had a bigger set than them. These guys would go where American pilots wouldn't go. They were just fearless. The funny thing about them, they made this funny sound because they were old choppers and that. But you don't ride in a King Bee and not get covered with transmission fluid, because these things, every single one of them, there'd be puddles of transmission fluid on the floor. They carried 5-gallon jugs of transmission fluid with them because they leaked so much. So when we'd get put in with the Hatchet force, they'd use every available chopper they could get of every kind. They'd use regular Hueys, they'd use the King Bees. And so all of my stories basically would have to do with CCC, because that's where I was at the whole time. So when we'd go on a mission, they'd fly us from Kontum up to Dak To, because there was an airstrip at Dak To, and it sat just almost on the border. So the choppers could have a full tank of fuel when they're ready to go insert us on a mission. And then when it came time to go in, we load on the choppers and the Cobras and the Charlie models, all the gunships, everybody's loaded and ready to go. And then we had a guy being either an Army or an Air Force pilot, and we called him Co.B, and a forward air controller is what he was. And then in the back seat, we normally had a guy, a Co.B rider, which was one of our guys that had a lot of experience on the ground. So during a battle, say, the Co.B rider would coordinate with us on the ground, and the pilot, the forward air controller, he would coordinate all the airstrikes or whatever, you know, with the aircraft. So we'd take off, they'd say, okay, we're ready to go, let's load up. Because sometimes there were multiple teams being put in on the same day. So you just wait your turn, and it might be afternoon. Nobody wanted to go in. Well, every once in a while, there'd be a team on a specific mission. They'd want to go in at last light. But normally, you want to go in where you got a few hours to maneuver and get to spot where you're going to spend the night, what we called an RON, rest overnight. So you'd get put in, and it's something that nobody really talks about, but it existed, and that is, so we're going on this mission in January of '69. And as soon as we crossed over the border, you know, keep in mind, you're sitting with your legs hanging over the side of the chopper so you could fire, and, you know, easy to get off and all that. And all of a sudden, a Russian MiG flies up alongside of us and slows down. You know, I've probably been on maybe 3 missions, and I'm about ready to have to change my pants because it's like, it's a MiG, you know, why doesn't he shoot us down? And it seemed like he was alongside of us for 30 seconds, but in reality, it was probably 5 or 10 seconds, because trying to slow down to stay even with us, that plane's going to drop out of the sky pretty soon. He couldn't maintain that for very long. Next thing you know, and he had a big mustache. You could tell he was an Oriental pilot. He salutes us and kicks in the afterburner and takes off. Nothing was said, you know, and of course we're going into combat, so we can't talk to the pilot of the chopper and, hey, what's going on here, or whatever. So as time goes by, that story was forgotten until a couple of years ago. And we get put in on this mission, and we do the mission, and coming out, all of a sudden there's all these black puffs of smoke around us, and the door gunner leans over to me and he says, flak, which is anti-aircraft fire, you know, and it's all these like mini explosions. Well, then all of a sudden he grabs his head and falls over, and, you know, it was a mess. And all of a sudden you hear this beep, beep, beep. Well, when you hear that, you know you're fixing to go down. So the chopper took whatever, a round or shrapnel or something in the engine or the transmission. Doesn't matter, either one. So the Hueys were made that if that happened, they would automatically go into what was called auto rotation, which was like a giant spiral. And so they could go around and around in a spiral, and then when they come into land, they're in forward motion. But man, when they hit the ground, those choppers don't have shock absorbers. You know, it's just solid aluminum. So it hit, and I didn't know it at the time again, but here I am 13 months later, and I break my back again. Because that impact, you're sitting on that hard aluminum floor. There's nothing to absorb the impact. So when that thing hits, I got another compression fracture in my lower back. So I had 2 of them, one right above the other, which I didn't know until about 10 years ago.
Jesus.
But anyway, the adrenaline's going so hard. I get off the chopper, and you always had what they called a chase ship, and that was a empty chopper that had a medic on board. And in this case, the chopper goes down, nobody's injured that we know of. And so everybody's going to pile on this other chopper and get out of there. Well, they had me plant some C4 on the dashboard of the chopper with all the radio equipment and everything. And then as I got on the other chopper and we got up in the air, the Cobras came in and fired rockets and blew the chopper up. Oh my God, what an explosion. You know, the fuel cells and everything's going up. But it destroyed the radios and, you know, anything that the bad guys would want to try to get a hold of. And we go back to camp. I had no idea I'd broken my back again. I had no idea I'd broke it the first time. All I knew is I shattered my ankle. But so we start going on missions. Probably for me, the most interesting mission, mainly because I got shot, a recon team had gone in and they found what appeared to be like a truck park. Okay. So they send us in, they send the Hatchet Force company in. March 25th, 1969. And that night, we're camped up on a hill. Well, the truck park is right down below us at the bottom of the hill. So you got the Ho Chi Minh Trail right below us. And all night long, we're hearing trucks pull up and stop, and they're refueling and eating and whatever. And you're trying to get a little bit of sleep, but it's hard to sleep when your adrenaline is at such a height. I had a dream, and I dreamed that the next day I was going to get shot in the left leg. Okay. So we go down off the hill in the morning, and immediately we're in contact because we're right there. And all the shooting starts. So I take my squad, and I was going to maneuver them in a wheeling motion, kind of wheeling around to the right and try to come in behind what I didn't know was there. But if I could come in behind the shooting, maybe we could take them by surprise from the back. This North Vietnamese pops up about 30 feet in front of me, and we see each other at the same instant. And I rolled like Hollywood or something, and I came up on one knee, and we both fired at the same time. And at the same instant that we fired, one of my guys, American, had fired a law rocket at a bunker. So there was a huge explosion and blew this bunker to pieces. Something hit my ankle. Well, the thing that crossed my mind was not this guy that just shot at me. It was somehow maybe a piece of shrapnel hit my ankle, but it was my left ankle on the outside, and the bunker and the rocket was way over to my right. So thinking back on it, logically, no, it couldn't have been a piece of shrapnel. It was a bullet. Well, he went to fire again, and he looked at his rifle, and he threw it down, and he goes to take off, and the pain really hadn't set in completely on my ankle yet. I throw a grenade, figure, okay, I can get him with a grenade. Well, it hit the bamboo and it bounced back and went off over us. At that time, I didn't carry an extra weapon. Most guys at least carried a pistol. But at that time, I still hadn't done it. I grabbed my knife. I thought, well, hell, I'm going to go after a guy with a knife, just like Hollywood, and we'll fight hand to hand, and I'll kill him and whatever. Nah, the pain stopped me, and it said, dude, you got something wrong. So anyway, I hear ceasefire, and all the shooting stops, and everything stops, and it's dead silent, except for a few voices. And I go sit down on the edge. The Ho Chi Minh Trail it's many things, but where we were at, it was a road that carried truck traffic. And, from erosion and stuff, after a while, you've got a short, maybe a 2-foot high embankment on each side of the road. So I go sit down on that embankment, and I thought, well, I'm going to take my boot off and see what's going on with my ankle. So I take my boot off, take my sock off. Something don't look right. And dead in the center of my ankle is a hole about the size of a pencil. There's no blood, no nothing. So I look over on my ankle bone, which is where I felt the impact of whatever it was, and I can see the outline of a bullet. And it's like, shit, I've been shot. So I called the medic and whatever. And each American, we carried 3 of these little bitty syrettes of morphine, and we all carried them in our right chest pockets. So that way you always knew, no matter who it was, you always knew where their morphine was at, right front pocket. I probably sat there 10 minutes waiting to shoot myself, and you just take the cap off, turn the needle around, and stick it in your leg and squeeze the little tube. It's like a miniature tube of toothpaste. It's just a little bitty thing. And you wait for the morphine to kick in. So I put my sock back on. There's a hole in the sock. I put my boot back on. There's a hole in the front of the boot. And I'm waiting for the medic, and we had another casualty, another American that was killed. And so he was a little bit busy. So I'm waiting. Well, then the morphine kicked in. Man, I get up and I got my camera and I'm walking around taking pictures, and I got a picture. I took a picture of the guy that shot me. Well, it turned out the reason he threw his rifle down and ran off was because my bullet, and I grew up with guns and hunting and all that, and I make no apologies for it. My bullet, so he's up like this shooting at me. My bullet hit right here. It hit the bolt of his rifle.
Wow.
He had an SKS rifle, and it hit the bolt, so the weapon would not work. So that's why he threw it down. So, and I've got a picture of me holding the rifle and all that.
That's incredible.
And I brought the rifle. Well, they brought a medevac in finally, and they pulled me and this lieutenant that got killed, pulled us out, went back to camp. We had to sit around at Dock Toe. I had to sit around at Dock Toe the rest of the afternoon until they shut down the launch site for the night and went back to camp at Khartoum. And they said, well, you're not that seriously injured, so if you can wait, we'll give you some more morphine. And, oh, don't worry, guys, I got some more. I got 3 of them. And so I took another morphine hit, and I was feeling no pain. And we sat around and went back to camp. We get back to camp, and the head medic in charge of our dispensary, they're looking and cleaning the wound and everything. Because, infection was a really big danger over there because of the heat and humidity and all that. And plus it was dirty. And I'm begging him. He says, well, you're going to get a good trip out of country, probably to Japan. And I said, well, can't you take the bullet out here? He says, no, we're not going to take the bullet out here. I said, you're trained to do it. He said, yeah, but there's too many things that could go wrong, including infection, and then you end up losing your leg or something. So we're going to send you back to camp, which was like 3 or 4 miles down the road. And in the morning, we'll have a chopper pick you up bright and early and take you down to Pleiku, which was about 23 kilometers south of us. And there was a big, regular, full-blown hospital down there. So I go back to camp, and I was able to pack a bag because I knew I was going somewhere, so I might as well pack some stuff. And chopper picks me up the next morning, and our radio at camp, which could pick up a lot of the transmissions, was right outside my room in the hallway, off the hallway. And all night long, the rest of the team was just getting hammered. They had a lot of casualties, and I'm like, oh God, I should be out there, Anyway, the next morning they pick me up, they take me down to the hospital, and you see in some of the movies when somebody gets wounded, they fill out what we call a toe tag, and they tie it to the toe or somewhere so that person is identified. Maybe it's got their name and whatever. So some of the information on there was like location of incident, whatever. So they take me down to the hospital, and I got this doctor. He's like, your toe tag says location was classified. He said, were you in Laos? Because he knew I was in special forces. And I said, it's classified, dude. No, it's classified. And he kept hammering at me. So finally he quits, and he says, are you allergic to any, or maybe it was a nurse. Are you allergic to anything? I said, yeah, I'm allergic to pentothal. And because I'd had surgery when I was about 8 years old, I had appendicitis, and that's when they learned I was allergic to it. Well, how do you know you're allergic to it? And I said, give me pentothal, and when I'm coming to in the recovery room and I beat the hell out of somebody, then you'll understand I get violent in the recovery room. Oh, okay. So they wrote it down. Last thing I remember, they take me into surgery, take the bullet out, and they leave the wound open. They pack it with gauze and all that, but they leave it open because they're going to send me to Japan. all I remember is coming to, and they got me strapped on a gurney waiting to take me to a room. And this captain is leaning over me again saying, were you in Laos? Because they used pentothal for the anesthetic.
Jesus.
And all I remember is I got my arm loose from the gurney. I took out 3 of his teeth, knocked him out cold, unconscious cold, and tipped my gurney over. And luckily they had me strapped in tight enough that when it hit the floor, I was like a couple of inches off the floor. And I told the nurse, I said, did I or did I not tell you that I get violent in the recovery room if you use pentothal? Well, you know, that's what the military uses for anesthetic. They don't anymore, obviously, but they got good stuff now. But anyway, so much for that doctor.
Oh, shit.
So again, there was a delay. Somebody screwed up and they didn't put me on the manifest to fly me to Japan. So it was 2 or 3 days, and they said, would you like to call home? I've been there for 6 months. Sure, let me call home. So they had a deal. I don't know. What they did was somehow they used a network of ham radio operators, and you give them your home phone number, and then somebody here in the States with a ham radio somehow gets your person you want to call on the phone and you can talk. So we get on there and my mom says, where are you at? And I said, I'm in the hospital. And they cut in and said, you're not allowed to disclose any details. And she says, you got shot in the left leg, didn't you?
Wow.
Right. And they said, well, you know, you can't discuss that. And I said, really? I said, what do you think? She said, okay, enough said. So they send me to Japan, and the second day I'm there, they sew me up. And you got to remember, this was at the height of the troop strength and of casualties. And that hospital was so backed up with casualties. So me and my ankle wound I mean, to me, it was minor compared to guys that lost arms and legs and had serious burns and, you know, all that kind of stuff. But they sewed me up. And then the next day, and this happened every single day of the month I was there, every day about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, stuff on your nightstand starts rattling and sliding towards the edge. And the nurse says, oh, don't worry about it. She says it's earthquake tremors. And we get it every day at the same time. You can set your watch by it. And I'm like, earthquake? Oh, God, you know. But anyway, we didn't have a real earthquake. It was just the tremors. 5:30 that afternoon, we're waiting on supper. I got to digress a bit. I was supposed to, after you had been there at least 6 months, you could go anywhere in the world you wanted for 10-day vacation. They called it R&R, rest and relaxation or whatever. And one of my best friends from high school was stationed in Japan. And he had gone to Vietnam before me. And when I was home on leave going to Vietnam, he was home on leave going to Japan. And of course, we stayed in touch. So the plan was the week after I got shot was the week I was supposed to go to Tokyo on R&R. Well, that ain't going to happen because I'm in the hospital. So at 5:30, I hear this voice, you ready to go? And I look up and I said, Chet, what are you doing here? And he says, we'll talk about that after we get out of here. He said, get dressed and let's go. Well, I got dressed because I had brought some civilian clothes with me and everything, you know. So we leave and, geez, he's got a car. He's got a girlfriend. Girlfriend's got a girlfriend. And I spent the next 3 weeks, got to ride the bullet train. And that was a real experience, 120 miles an hour, standing up on this train that you're packed into like sardines. Got to see the Ginza, which was the Japanese Tokyo equivalent of Las Vegas. All kinds of stuff. We got to do all kinds of stuff. So I'm like, how did you know I was here? keeping in mind that this was so highly classified, but all of our missions had to be approved either by the president or by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So he says, well, this communications group that I'm in, we relay every day, we relay messages from Saigon, from headquarters of all of Vietnam. We relay messages back to the White House. Okay. He said, well, when you got shot, it came across going back to the White House that your name, serial number, all that stuff, you had gotten shot and you were being sent to this hospital. So he said, I just work right down the street, so it wasn't too hard to track you down. You know, I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
It's a small
And
world.
to this day, we still laugh about that because to me, it's one of the funniest stories. I mean, who would believe it? So anyway, I'm in the hospital for 3.5 weeks, maybe. And when it's time to get out, when it's time to get out, they give you a sheet of paper to fill out. And they said, well, you can pick where you want to go within limits. And he said, Special Forces, you got two choices, Korea or Vietnam. I said, well, I've already been to Vietnam, but I don't want to go to Korea because it's cold. I hate the winter. So I checked Vietnam. And they said, well, you got to go see the doctor then. I said, why? And they said, anybody that says they want to go back to Vietnam has to go see the shrink. So I go see the shrink, and he's like, why do you want to go back to Vietnam? And I said, well, let's see. I volunteered for jump school. I volunteered for special forces. I volunteered for Vietnam. I've only been there 6 months out of a 13-month tour. So I still got 7 months to go. Is that enough of an answer? And he signs off on it. So they give me orders. Well, the orders just assigned me to the 90th Replacement Battalion in Cam Ranh Bay. Now, all the other line units and that, everybody was suffering heavy casualties. But the orders did not specify 5th Special Forces Group. So I get to this replacement thing outside of Saigon or Cam Ranh Bay. No, it was Saigon. And they're going to assign me to some unit outside of Special Forces. And I'm like, no, this ain't happening. So in SOG, we had our own private airplanes. They were C-130s that were painted black and green. They had no markings on them. They were flown by Filipino contract pilots. And they had the skyhook thing on the front, like you see in the movie where they lift the balloon up and it comes and lifts you up, you know, and all that stuff. I only know of one incident where it was ever used for real. Anyway, I just left and hitched a ride to the airport, and I found one of our C-130s. And every day they did what they called a milk run and went around to the places. So I asked the crew chief, I said, are you going to go to Nha Trang? And he says, yes, in a few minutes. So can I go? And he said, yeah, hop on, you know. And by that time, I had taken one of my uniforms with me. So I had my beret on and everything. So he knew I was one of them. So I fly to Nha Trang, and I get there. I go into the headquarters, and I found the sergeant major. And I said, I told him what had happened. I said, they're trying to assign me outside of Special Forces. And he said, I'll take care of it. He said, you're just one of many that they were doing that to. But most guys didn't fight it. They just let themselves get reassigned. And it's like, no, there's always a way around something. So I don't know what kind of hoops he had to go through, but they got orders reassigning me to 5th Group. And then I got a Blackbird and went up to Kontum and went back to camp. And the rifle, I had brought the rifle back that shot me. And I still have in a frame out in the workshop. I've got the rest of the bullets out of that rifle in a frame. Because,
Wow.
I mean, who else has that?
No kidding.
You know. And I opened my locker to put my stuff away. And it's like, okay, where's my rifle? Oh, the sergeant major took it and he used it to trade for floor tile for the club. I could have brought that gun home because it was semi-automatic. All I had to do was fill out a 1-sheet piece of paper, and I could have brought it home, but it's gone now. So, there's a couple of funny stories in there, and the one about my mom and me having the dream the same night, same leg and everything, and then of course my buddy showing up at the hospital. Then I got shot a total of 3 times, plus that shot down in the helicopter. So I get back, and within a couple of weeks, we went on a mission. The only time I ever went into Cambodia, and we were going into Cambodia to help out CCS down at Bamituit because they'd taken a lot of casualties in that. So we went in, well, it was in May, which is the beginning of the rainy season. We're on a hilltop dug in. The road is right below us. You got trucks pulling up all day and all night long. The clouds, we were up above the clouds. So when it came time to get us out, they couldn't get us out, and we're hearing the bad guys pulling up day and night. So we know we're heavily surrounded. And I guess I can tell this story. So coming back from Japan, where it was, into April, it was still kind of cool over there. And I get back to the 120 degrees, and I ended up with dysentery. Well, you know what dysentery is.
Yeah.
So when we went on this mission, because I wanted to go, I don't know, I just felt at home out in the field on a mission. And I took 2 big bottles of kale pectate with me. So we get, and I'm gulping it all day long. So we get to where we set up on this hill and we get dug in and everything. Well, then it hit me. So like a fool, I went outside our perimeter without my rifle or anything. I'm out there, pants down around my knees, taking care of business, and all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose and the shooting begins. And I'm thinking, oh. So I got back in I never did that again. You never go, at least take your rifle with you if you're going to do it. And we ended up being in there for a week, and a bunch of us, me included, ended up with what they called immersion foot, and that's from standing in water for a long, if you get in a swimming pool or a hot tub sometimes and you stay too long and your skin gets all puffy and whatever. So in my case, I spent a week, 2 weeks, 2 weeks or 3, I don't know. Had to lay in bed with my feet up and put this cream on 3 times a day. And probably for 30, 40 years after that, my feet sweated really bad and all that. But at least there was a recon team that was very close to us, but we couldn't get them to us. But they'd been out there even longer, and one of those guys lost both his feet because of it. It's terrible.
Well, but that brings up a point I've seen you mention earlier of signing the dotted line. You knew what you were getting into. That's part of the jobs.
In years later, after I'm out of the Army, and all that kind of stuff, my attitude, well, I never joined like the American Legion or the VFW, and I'm not bad mouthing them. All I'm saying is I had enough experience. These old guys from probably World War II and Korea and whatever, they're in the bar at the club at 8 o'clock in the morning drinking, and they sit in there drinking all day, crying in their beer, getting shit faced. And
okay, Terry.
I wasn't gonna say stuff like that. Anyway, I just never wanted to be like that. And my attitude was, okay, I volunteered for the Army. I didn't get drafted. I joined. I volunteered for jump school. I volunteered for Special Forces. I volunteered for Vietnam. I volunteered for SOG. By God, I went into this with my eyes wide open, knowing what to expect. And in my opinion, I had no right to whine and complain later just because I got shot 3 times. anyway, so while we're dug in and on the hill in Cambodia, we got a firefight going on, and I'm standing in my hole in my water up to my ankles shooting and everything. And my glasses fell off. Okay, fine. Wait till the shooting's done. Shooting's over with. I go to wipe my forehead thinking it's sweat, because it's 120 degrees and 100% humidity. It's raining off and on. The clouds are below us. They can't get to us. So I go to wipe my forehead and it was blood. What now? So my right on the side here was stinging. Well, I picked my glasses up and they're no good anymore. What had happened was a bullet came from, it would have been probably 11 o'clock to me. The bullet came and it took off the corner of my glasses and just skimmed along my eyebrow. I can't find the scar. My wife says she can see it if she looks, but it's not real obvious or anything. And I didn't even turn it in for a Purple Heart. The medic, he took care of it, and I said, don't even turn it in. So that was my second time they finally got us out. And then a bunch of other operations, which the VA tells me too many concussions. I've got a little bit of memory loss. It's mostly short-term stuff. Like my wife will send me a message in the morning, don't forget to take something out of the freezer for supper. Well, if she doesn't send me a message, I ain't gonna remember it. But yet some of these missions I can tell in some amount of detail. So in September, we were on a mission. I don't remember details of the mission, although I took a bullet in the side. And again, it was just a flesh wound about the size of my thumb. Had the medic bandage it up and put some, did he put stitches in? He may have put a couple of stitches in. But anyway, it's just a scar about the size of a quarter now. Whatever. I wasn't over there to win medals and all that kind of stuff. I was over there the saying at the time was kill a commie for mommy, and, but being young, 20 years old, being young and foolish. And well, by then I was 21. So I was shot down in the helicopter and I was shot 3 times. None of them were serious, not a big deal. I count myself very fortunate. I thank the lucky stars every day I wake up in the morning. So continued to run missions and whatever. Then came home from Vietnam in April of 70. And then I had orders to report into the 7th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg. So I reported in there, and then I went to the hospital a couple of times to have them look at my right ankle that I had shattered on my last jump at jump school. And these doctors, and of course, you got to remember back then we didn't have MRIs either. I'll go to physical therapy for 3 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever. Finally, on the 4th time, I had a doctor. He had been a combat surgeon in Vietnam. So he was used to dealing with traumatic injuries. And he got some x-rays and he said, I don't know why they send you to physical therapy, because there's no way that physical therapy is going to heal up a shattered ankle. So we need to operate. So Monday, October 16th of 1971, I went into surgery. They rebuilt my ankle. By Friday, my first wife lived about 45 miles from Fort Bragg. So her dad came up and got me and took me down to their house. On Friday, he had to bring me back to the hospital because I had 105 fever. They gave me a shot of Demerol, cut a window in the cast. I was in a full leg cast. They cut a window in the cast, and they didn't wait for the Demerol to kick in. And they literally rip the incision open and then use disinfectant like betadine or something and Q-tips, and they literally scrape the infection out.
Ugh.
Well, then they left a window in the cast and they pack it, and they're giving me IV antibiotics and all that stuff. Well, the IV antibiotics were not killing the infection. So on Monday, they said, tomorrow morning, we're going to have to take your leg off at the knee. It's like, no, you're not. And I made a phone call. Before you could hardly say boo, here's a general and a colonel up there, special forces guys, like, what the hell's going on? Oh, he's got an infection, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the next morning, they were going to take me to surgery at 7:30. Literally at 7 o'clock in the morning, the fever broke. 7 o'clock in the morning, 30 minutes, and I would have been losing my leg. So they said, well, you're going to be spending some time in the hospital because we're going to have to let this heal from the inside out so that we don't risk any more infection. So I spent 3.5 months in the hospital. And again, this is the stupidest thing I ever heard. The Army came out with a policy, or maybe it was just at Fort Bragg, I don't know. But it said, if your doctor approves, you can have up to a 6-pack of beer a day while you're in the hospital. Well, you know, I mean, what the hell? When I came home on leave the final time, I was drinking 2 cases of beer a day until I went cold turkey. So I was 6-pack of beer a day. And I really wasn't that interested in having a beer. But one night I just really wanted a beer. Well, I'm in a ward and there's 35 of us in this big ward. And we had one nurse responsible for that whole ward. Well, she's busy. I mean, I got a guy next to me that ran his motorcycle up against a guardrail and took the meat on his thigh all the way down to the bone. He'd already died 3 times. It was more important for this nurse to deal with that stuff than for me to push the buzzer and say, hey, I want a beer. So she's busy. So I get out of bed, my full cast, my crutches, and I go in the nurse's station and I figure, well, I'm going to get me a beer out of the fridge. Well, they got a padlock on it. Okay, fine. No beer. I got curious and I got my chart. And I started reading my chart. Patient sustained massive infection due to unsanitary conditions in operating room. So I almost lost my leg because of some unsanitary. So you only saw your doctor, like in my case, because it wasn't serious. I didn't consider it serious. I only saw the doctor like once a week. So the next time I saw him, you know, he's doing rounds and he's got a nurse and whatever. And I cornered him. I said, okay, you want to explain to me about this He said, well, how do you know that? I said, it's in my chart. He says, that chart's for the nurse. That's not for you. I said, well, there was nobody in there and I got nosy and I looked at my chart. I said, what are you going to do about it? You know, I mean, I read it. He said, we don't know what happened. He said, it could have been an instrument that wasn't sterilized properly. It could have been one of the people working in the operating room that maybe had a cold or something. Could have been a lot of things. We don't know what it was. And I said, well, you know, I almost lost my leg because you don't know what it was. Anyway, so from October, then in January, I don't know, it was almost the end of January. They said, you're never going to be fit for duty for special forces again because you've got limited range of motion in your ankle now from the surgery and the infection. So just start processing out. And 2 days later, I was out of the Army. Boo. You know? Yeah, just like that. So that was my Army career. 5 years, 1 month, 28 days.
Now, with that, I mean, you've got an incredible career. You've got incredible stories during and after. And this has prompted a lot of questions that I've made mental notes of. And one of the ones I wanted to touch on today was the weaponry. I know a lot of people are fascinated with MACVSOG and the weapons that you guys utilized because there's photographs of every single weapon in the arsenal. So did you have a personal preference, Terry, that you like to carry out in the field?
M16, and then when I came back from the hospital from Japan, we got issued the CAR 15s, which were much shorter, had the kind of like the M4s today, had the telescoping stock, had an 11.5-inch barrel on it, much easier in the jungle to maneuver around than a full-size M16. But when I first got there and Bob Howard was working in supply, we had that conversation. He said, now you can carry whatever weapon you want. He said you could carry a Swedish K submachine gun, which is a 9mm, has 30-round clips. You can carry an AK-47. We had some recon teams that dressed in North Vietnamese uniforms and carried NVA weapons because their philosophy was if you ran into some bad guys on the trail, that split second that it would take them to recognize or think you're NVA gives you the upper hand and you could take them out. There were some a couple of famous recon guys that had the Russian submachine gun called an RPD. It had I think it was a 100-round magazine in it. They'd cut the barrel down and make some modifications to it. But I tried the Swedish K. I had an M3 grease gun, a World War II 45 caliber grease gun, which I traded to an engineer that was adjacent to our camp. I traded him an M16 that was turned in as what they call battlefield loss. So it didn't have to be accounted for anymore. It got written off the books. So I traded that to him for this grease gun. I traded another one of the engineers. He had a Thompson submachine gun, you know, a gangster gun. I traded him an M16 for the submachine gun. We had Israeli Uzis available. Had all these guns, and I just preferred the M16. A lot of different reasons. And one was the weight of the ammunition. You know, a 30-round magazine for the 45 caliber grease gun weighed probably as much as 2 or 3 20-round magazines for the M16. So when you go to the field, you're carrying probably 75 to 100 pounds on your back. And to me, every pound counts. But again, if they got to do a resupply, for instance, let's say you're almost out of ammo, you're going to stay for a while longer, whatever. It was easier for resupply because we're all using M16s, or the M60 machine gunners had the 7.62s, but all the rest of us, you got M16s. It was easier logistically, but I preferred the M16, you know. And having tried all of them, I still preferred it, you know.
Well, and that's why I was going to bring up this photograph that I've got off the MACVSOG website here.
Yes, okay.
And
that's actually my favorite picture.
Well, I was going to say, of what I've been able to find, this is my favorite picture that I've seen of you. You've got this hard charging looking Green Beret, 5th Special Forces, of course, SOG operator. So what's with the photograph? What's in the kit here, Terry, for the viewers? What are we looking at?
What a badass looking dude, man.
Ain't that the truth?
Okay. The black sweater, for instance, we got a lot of gear from a group over in Okinawa called CISO, Counterinsurgency Organization, I don't know, whatever. But they were making all kinds of stuff. So they gave us all these black sweaters. So during the winter time, you know, at nighttime, we're in the mountains. So keep in mind, you know what the mountains are like, right?
Sure.
it could get cold. It actually would get down in the 30s sometimes. So you got to be warm. And this happened to be one of them times. And I'm wearing that sweater. I probably have been off the chopper coming back from a mission for maybe 5 minutes. And I had my Montagnard girlfriend take my camera and take this picture. So let's start at the top. So in the picture, it's on your left, on my right shoulder, you see like a pouch right there on my shoulder. And that's a nylon pouch. And that's where we carried our strobe light. So at night, if you're in a firefight and you got to work airstrikes or something in the dark, you could open that pouch and that strobe light, there was enough up past the top of the strobe light that it would funnel the strobe light straight up. So you could mark your position for the aircraft with the strobe light. Right below that, you see a little metal, it's like a 35 mil, no, go up higher.
Let's see if I can get the thing to work. Here we go.
Now, stop. Now go too far. Now go down about a very small amount. Go down off that pouch.
Right here?
Right there.
Yep.
Okay. On both sides, you see one of those. And those were mini smoke grenades.
Yep. I see that one there.
Your regular smoke grenades were pretty good sized. I mean, they were probably a size of a beer can. And of course, along with that comes weight. So these little smoke grenades were nice. If you go over to my other shoulder, you got a couple of things. That white thing is, let's see. What you're on now, I think, was that's the strap for my web gear. And then just to the left of it was a bandage, I call them a cravat, a very large bandage. And then the color that's over the bandage is actually masking tape, because you can see right to the left of your little dot the hilt of my knife.
Yep.
I carried a Air Force survival knife. A lot of guys carried like the Marine Corps
the K-bar.
K-bar. I carried the survival knife because it was a really thick blade. It had saw teeth on the back of it. The hilt of it was a big solid piece of steel that you could use for hammering if you had to. So some of us carried those, and it was matter of preference. Again, there was no rules. You carry whatever you want. I just found that to be more practical. Some guys were carrying these commando knives and stuff, like from World War II. How many guys can actually say that they were ever in a hand-to-hand fight? There's a couple, but very, very few. So to prepare for something that's very rare to start with, why waste the time? Use something that's more practical. And then right below that was another bandage, because you're always using your bandages. After I got shot the first time, I swore I would never go out there again without a backup weapon. Now, every one of us was issued a 1911, a 45 automatic. I was afraid of automatics, only because, back in the day, you didn't have all these different automatics that are out there today. I grew up with revolvers. When we got to Vietnam, one of the guys that I went through training with and went over with, everybody would go down to town and buy these Western holsters and whatever. In fact, the holster that you see holding my pistol was one that I had. Anyway, he had a shoulder holster and he was practicing quick draw with a locked and loaded 1911. Well, you know what happened.
Yeah.
It went off. The bullet went in his hip and came out at his knee, and he ended up losing his leg and his entire leg because he was playing quick draw. You know, totally stupid. But anyway, so again, I traded one of our pilots. I traded him a Car 15 for that little 38 revolver because they were issued 38s. They weren't issued 1911s. And then, so I carried that right there in the front. So if something happened with my Car 15, I got that pistol right there. You see a grenade. So I had one on each hip where my hand is, my left hand, and the other one you can't see because of the rifle, but they were the kind of squared off ammo pouches. And I think they held 4 20-round mags, and the grenades hanging off. There were little loops on the sides, so we hung grenades on there. And then the rest of my ammo, I carried on the Hatchet force. The volume of ammo wasn't as critical because you had more people as opposed to a recon team. I did a podcast this morning with a buddy of mine. He was with me when I got shot that first time, but he also ran recon. When he was running recon, he was carrying like 600 or 700 rounds. I was carrying 400, and that was pretty standard for the Hatchet force. So you had canteen covers. You take the canteen out and you don't need it. And you could put like 4 or 5 mags in the canteen cover. And before you'd snap it shut, you could put a grenade in on top of the magazines. And then you'd carry extra grenades wherever. Some guys carried them on their web gear. Usually in my rucksack, I'd have 3 or 4 extra grenades. I'd carry Claymore in my rucksack. I'd carry a 1 pound block of C4, because you never know if you're going to have to blow something up. We had a lot of equipment that was made in Okinawa was made for our soldiers, our indigenous, our Montagnards. The ponchos we had were these big, heavy, rubberized things. The Montagnard poncho was very extremely lightweight nylon that was coated with something to make it waterproof. And they probably weighed about what a cigarette weighs. So I always carried one of them. In fact, I've still got a couple of them out in the workshop.
Wow.
And then sleeping bags. Well, you didn't carry an American. If you were lucky enough to get any kind of sleep at all, in the Hatchet force, we'd take turns stand and watch during the night. And I carried an indigenous poncho, which was just a real thin layer of nylon with felt like flannel on the inside, and you could snap it up. Didn't use it very often, but that was there. We lost the picture.
Bring it back up.
Going down, I don't know if that picture even goes any lower on. Oh, you can barely see it. So on each thigh, there was a big, what we called a cargo pocket. So that left pocket, I would put my map. There was a little bitty pocket inside of that big pocket, and it was just big enough to hold a little Browning 25 automatic pistol. And that was my Custer's Last Stand pistol, which thank God I never had to use it. And there's no telling what else was in that pocket. On the other side, on my right leg, was our big orange panel that we would use for marking for the choppers or where to land. And they were rather big. So a lot of guys, what they did, instead of carrying that big old panel, they'd take the boonie hat and cut the brim down to real narrow, maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches around, and take it down into town to Mama San, the seamstress, and have her sew orange nylon on the inside of the hat. So that way, if you're running or whatever, and you need to let them know where you're at, you could turn your hat inside out. You still got your hands free to do whatever. And that orange would shine like a beacon to the choppers. Legs, of course, you're wearing your jungle boots, but leeches were a big problem over there. You go through any kind of water, you're almost guaranteed you're going to get leeches. Well, if you just pulled your pants legs down and used those elastic bands we call blousing bands or something, the leeches are going to get up there and you're going to have leeches all over your lower legs. So what I did was I would tuck my pants into my socks. The Army, standard Army issue socks were these knee-high olive green, OD green socks. So I would tuck my pants into my socks. And that was my, at least I could keep the leeches from getting up inside my pants or something. I guess that, well, then on my left wrist, of course, I'm wearing a watch. Other than that, you know, we went sterile, which means there were no markings on anything. That way, if we got captured and the North Vietnamese tried to make an issue out of it, we could always claim, oh, we strayed across the border, we were on, you know, whatever. But there was also nothing to identify us as Americans.
Well, I was just about to ask, on operations, would you wear dog tags or anything? And that, of course,
Nope.
covers that, because it makes perfect sense. Now, what was the plan if you did end up falling into the hands of the North Vietnamese?
Good luck to you. It wasn't pretty. There's a number of examples of guys who were captured alive and tortured and executed. There were some guys who were captured alive and taken up all the way up to Hanoi, and a few guys that were released in 73. But for the most part, if you were captured in Laos, you stayed in Laos. And the Laotians to this day have never accounted for any Americans held in Laos. They've never acknowledged that there were. They've never denied it. They've never done anything. They just won't discuss it. Over the years, there's been different scenarios and people that claim to have knowledge of living Americans in Laos and all that. Our government sold them down the river for the sake of politics, basically. There's one incident where a team was captured alive, and the one American, they disemboweled him while he was still alive and then burned him up with a flamethrower. And they sent the other guy back. They let him live, and they said, you go back and tell your people this is what will happen to any of you that we capture. It didn't work, but the Orientals were very sadistic. You know, torture was part of their repertoire, you know. So yeah, I mean, so when I say we'd go sterile, it's really kind of funny because your M16 has got on her Colt Firearms Manufacturing. Of course, anybody from any country could have got, you know, one of them. Something that I've never heard discussed is on your uniforms, inside the uniforms, pants and the shirt, there's a little label that identifies it as what, utility, comma, OD, you know, and all this manufacturer's part numbers and all, you know. So yeah, we're sterile, but in our vernacular, sterile, no dog tags, nothing that would identify you by name, rank, serial number, even as an American. And that was crucial because, you know, the government didn't want the North Vietnamese to say, well, you got guys in Laos and here's one of them. when we're trying to prove that the North Vietnamese are in Laos, but how are we proving it if we can't, if we're so secret, you know? But yeah, for the most part, everything was sterile.
Well, and with that too, I mean, with the covert operations, not being able to talk about it for 20 years, that's another factor as well. As there's no proof, is that you don't know, these guys aren't there, there's no identification. And I was about to ask, I guess this leads into that. Were you allowed any communication to your family from working in CCC?
Well, I mean, I would write home. I would write letters home, yeah. But another story here. You're not, you know, we weren't allowed to talk about what we were doing or any details on missions and what have you like that. You could just say, "Hi, Mom. How's everybody doing? You know, I'm doing fine. Everything's okay." Blah, blah, blah. My brother, who was 13 months younger than me, when I got into special forces, he thought he was going to best me because he has always thought he was better. So he joined the Marines. He went to Vietnam a month before me, and he was an advisor to a company of South Korean Marines. And there's some stories there. Those guys were badass. And my brother and I, we took turns getting shot and wounded and all that stuff. And I think that's partly why my mom went crazy, you know, because we were, you know. But yeah, I mean, you could just talk generally. Oh, the weather, it's 120 degrees. But what they told us was that we should expect that any letter we wrote, any outgoing mail was subject to being opened for that reason, to make sure we weren't, you know, no, I don't think I told the story about the reporters. So at the end of October of '69, I was getting ready to come home on leave for my extension. After your 13-month tour, you could apply to come back in 6-month increments. So every 6 months you'd fill out the paperwork. So I was getting ready to go home on leave. So my company, the word had come down from a so-called North Vietnamese defector of a location of a prisoner of war camp that held some Americans, pilots, and special forces guys. So the company went in, and it was a trap. And I think we lost 6 choppers or 6 aircraft total that day. 2 Americans were killed right off the bat. One of them was named Ronald Bozikas. And so I left later the next day. I left to come home on leave. And when my mom picked me up at the airport, did you know Ronald Bozikas? I said, yeah, he got killed the other day. And she said, well, his funeral is this afternoon. And it was at the same cemetery where my grandparents and great-grandparents are buried. So my cousin picked me up in his Corvette convertible, and we went to the funeral, and I met the family and went back to the house. And then the family proceeds to show me these letters that he wrote home. He's given out every detail of every operation and I mean, so the end result of all that was his father wanted the Army to change his records and his medals and that to say that he was killed in Laos. Because they said at that time they would say he was killed on an operation in enemy-controlled territory in South Vietnam, you know. And his dad, who was a World War II veteran, and they were from, I think it was Czechoslovakia, I'm not positive, but Eastern Bloc country. His dad then was on a mission to do everything he could to force the Army to acknowledge that his son was killed in Laos. So when I got out of the Army in '72, I became a police officer, and the father went and he sicked some reporters on me. So I did some interviews, and these reporters, they had all the information. And using my interrogation skills, I was able to find out that they got their information from 2 helicopter, either pilots or crewmen, and a special forces captain who I knew, and I had served with him. And when he got out of the Army, he became like a John Kerry. He became anti-war, blah, blah, blah. So he was more than willing to spill the guts, because the reporters aren't going to give away his name, their sources. But I got it out of them. And so they're, well, did you do this? Were you in Laos? Were your missions, blah, blah, blah? And I said, I can't disclose any of that because I'm under a 20-year non-disclosure and I don't want to go to Leavenworth. Well, we've already got all this information. I said, yeah, you do. But that doesn't mean I'm going to give you anything else. And then the father passed away that year. So that was the end of the reporters. I didn't have to deal with that anymore. And so it wasn't until 91 when SOG was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. And in order to write it up and do this big ceremony and blah, 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 they had to declassify everything. So that's when it all got officially declassified. Unfortunately, when they shut SOG down in 1974, all the records were burned.
Wow.
And I say all the records, that's not really true. It was all the official records from Saigon and all that. But a lot of guys kept copies of like after action reports. Thank God a ton of us broke the rules and took pictures, because we weren't supposed to take pictures at all. If we didn't take pictures, all these books that are out and that have all these multitudes of pictures wouldn't exist, because again, it was kind of the thing, what are you going to do? Send me to Vietnam? I'm already here, right? So, so there's a lot of pictures, and it's all been declassified now. Everybody wants to say they're in SOG. Some of these Facebook groups that I belong to on SOG, I don't know, it seems like almost every week there's at least one of somebody will say, well, so my dad or my uncle or my neighbor said he was in SOG, and was he? And there's places we can go to verify a lot of that. And I don't know that 9 times out of 10 is correct, but so often, no, they weren't in SOG. They weren't even in Special Forces. They weren't even in Vietnam. There's all these different scenarios of these. Everybody wants to say they were in Special Forces. Everybody wants to say they were in SOG. And that wasn't the case. At any given time between the 3 camps of Bam Me Tuot, Kon Tum, and Da Nang, there was probably not more than 350 Americans total involved in these missions. So over a period of 5 or 6 years, maybe 3,000 guys? Probably 95% of our guys volunteered for multiple tours.
Right.
Probably 3,000 to 3,500 men total that could ever say they served in SOG. And then, of course, you had air crews who supported us, but supporting us wasn't the same as being on the ground. And that's not to demean them any, because they're the ones that kept us alive. But they weren't actually assigned to SOG. They were assigned to helicopter units or Air Force units or whatever,
Well, I'm glad you brought up the numbers, because a lot of people don't know the number of SOG veterans, or let me rephrase that, SOG active duty members there were in country. I mean, that's a small percentage of the total of those who saw combat in Vietnam alone.
Think about 1.5 million men over there in late '68. Okay, you got 1.5 million troops, and there's only maybe if you count the people in SOG headquarters and all that, maybe what, 400 or so involved with SOG. You know, not very many. I mean, not even 1%.
No, Lord, no.
Oh no. So yeah, I mean, and a story that I like to tell to illustrate how secret and what I call how compartmentalized it was. So there's a couple of guys that I went through training with. One of them was my roommate for 6 months in training before we went over there. He was in recon. I didn't know he was even at the same camp I was at. We had been there 14 months and we're on an operation and we're blocking the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And his recon team, they landed them in the middle of our perimeter and they walked off the hill, and that way the North Vietnamese wouldn't know where they were at, you know. And this was a mission where Doug Miller was awarded the Medal of Honor for. Well, one of his Americans, Glenn Yamura, we called him Pineapple. He was from Hawaii. I saw Pineapple getting off the chopper. Now, keep in mind, I hadn't seen him for, let's see, October, November, 16 months. I hadn't seen him. I didn't even know he was at the same camp I was at until I saw him getting off the chopper. Another buddy of mine from training group that went over, when I went home and got my car and brought it back, you know, I went through Alabama and I picked him up, David Gilmer. He was on recon. I didn't know he was there until just a couple of years ago, and I read in one of the books and it mentioned his name. You know, and we're all at the same camp. I didn't hang out in the club like a lot of the guys did. I did my drinking in my room. I had a refrigerator. I bought it to PX. You know, it's amazing what a little extra cash will do. You know, and so here's guys that, you know, we've been through training group together and everything, and yet I'm living maybe 200 yards from where he's living, and I don't even know he's there, you know. But that's how compartmentalized it was. You know. So unless you hung out in the club on a frequent, regular basis, you didn't run into these guys.
That's incredible.
It's just, you know, and because of the non-disclosure in that, you didn't really do a lot of talking outside of school. Now, a lot of the recon team guys especially would sit in the club, but what they'd be talking about is lessons learned out in the field. And that was pretty beneficial to most all of them. I mean, you know, what worked, what didn't work, you know, and all that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, it was just, when we came back to the States, so I was in 7th group. So when they figured out from the doctors that I was going to have my ankle rebuilt, they took me off a team and they put me working in the company office. And they made me a morning report clerk. So my main responsibility was to do the morning report that you turned in to headquarters. You know, troop strength, how many people are on leave, how many people are out sick, blah, 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 and all that crap. Well, another guy who worked in the office, and I knew he'd been to Vietnam, but just, oh God, 6 months ago, I was going through all my orders and stuff, and I had an order for in training group. We all got our shooting badge, you know, expert with an M16. And I'm looking at all the names on there, and there's some names that some people would say were famous. Doug Letourneau, known as the Frenchman. He was in my class. But anyway, this guy's name was Tony Bandera. So here's Tony. It's like, well, shit, we were in the same company and training group. It's like, and here we spent a year and a half sitting in the same office, and we never knew. He didn't know I'd been in SOG. I didn't know he had been in SOG. he was at CCN at Da Nang and I was at CCC. But in that year and a half that we worked together in the office, we never even, because we didn't talk about it. It was still classified and we're still under that non-disclosure. So I just, a couple of weeks ago, I told him that I'd found these orders and that I didn't realize all these different things that we had done together and we had no idea, just no idea at all. So, kind of, but I think it's a good example of, again, the term I use, compartmentalized.
Most definitely.
You do this, so this is where you hang and this is what you focus on. I did this, so this is what I did and focused on, and never the twain shall meet. Unless you happen to run into somebody going in the mess hall or walking across the compound and you recognized them, there's a real good chance of what happened with me that I didn't even know these guys were there all this time.
Yep.
It's just really strange.
Well, that, and with the various SOG teams over time, I mean, it is strange, though, with the fact of what happens in country. The stories do differentiate, the jobs differentiate, and then the Non-Disclosure Act. I mean, only till recently, with the 90s and the last 20 years, have memoirs, books, and documentaries started to come full fledged.
So the phrase "what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas." Well, it was kind of it was the same thing as what happened in SOG stays in SOG. So in other words, once you leave SOG and you go outside, you don't talk about it because I ain't going to risk going to Leavenworth for 20 years,
The good reason not to risk that.
Yeah, I mean, plus 72, 73, I mean, there were still missions going on. So you don't want to jeopardize by saying anything or talking about tactics or whatever, because you still got guys, in spite of what the official records show, you still got guys on the ground. And there's stories that don't need to be told and that will never be told because, there's things that, yeah, officially there were no more Americans on the ground over in Laos after some magical date, whatever, you don't need to know any different. Just believe what you read and, but for every story that any one of us can tell, and again, any story that I can tell is probably not that much different except for the humorous stuff that any other guy that did, because I didn't do anything special. I mean, we all did something special. It's not that what I did stood out over what somebody else did. But there's all these stories, and in some ways they'll be real similar, and in some ways they'll be, okay, close, and in other ways they're totally different. And I found that to be true, especially when you're comparing a recon mission versus a Hatchet Force mission, because of numbers. Totally different.
Carry on.
The way we operated, the way we ran. So yeah, I've learned from doing, like with Bud, I think today, the one I did this morning, I think it's the 17th one I've done with him. What it's made me come to realize is over the years, I've had 41 major surgeries, including cancer and, both hips replaced and all this other nonsense. But I never really made it. Once I got what I consider kicked out of the Army because of my ankle injury, I never really, we didn't have the internet back then. So I never really stayed in touch with anybody that I knew. And even though I joined the Special Operations Association back in the early 80s, I think my membership number is 339. But other than getting a newsletter once a year, they'd have these reunions in Las Vegas. Well, Vegas ain't my thing. I've been there, done that. And I never went. And 5 or 6 years, 7 years ago, whenever I was asked, have you ever been to the SOAR reunion, the Special Operations Association reunion? And I said, no, I can't really afford it. Well, they have a program for guys that want to go, they can't afford it. And everything was paid. I went. And, you know, you see all these old guys, and all they're doing is from the time the hospitality room opens until it closes, they're just sitting there getting shit-faced drunk and telling war stories. And I outgrew that a long time ago. And I think I went 3 years in a row, maybe 4. And I got reacquainted with a couple of guys. And from these Facebook pages, and this is where the internet does something good. Thanks to these Facebook pages, I've gotten reacquainted with, like, one guy I just talked to a week ago Sunday, and we spent a couple hours on the phone, and we're going to start at least once a month visiting on the phone. He lives in Florida and I live in Missouri, but we were actually roommates for a period of time.
Wow.
And one of the funny stories we were cracking up over is I asked him, I said, John, I keep thinking of a story. Did I loan you my camera one time? And he bust out laughing, and he said, yeah. He says, go ahead. I said, well, I loaned you the camera. And when you came back off the mission, I asked you where my camera is, and you told me it had a little accident. And he was carrying it where I carried my pistol, right in front in an ammo pouch, so he could get to it quickly to take pictures. They got in a firefight, and it took a bullet right in the camera. And it stopped the bullet. Otherwise, he said, I'd have been dead because I'd have been gut shot, you know? And, you know, there's stories like that, and we're just cracking up. But I've realized doing these podcasts that I really fell short in staying in touch with guys who really meant something to me. Vernon Ward, who I did the podcast with this morning, was with me when I got shot the first time. And I got reacquainted with him in 2022. I found out that every year in September, the 5th Special Forces Group has a big reunion down in Clarksville, Tennessee at Fort Campbell, where they're stationed. And I went, and Vern had seen me on Facebook, and we became friends on Facebook. But then I was sitting in the hospitality room visiting with some folks, and Vern came walking in. I hadn't seen him in since 1970. So, no, 1969. So here we are, 54 years later. And I recognized him the minute he walked in the door.
Wow.
You know, and now we're buds, and we stay in touch regularly. We did this podcast today, and everybody's already asking for he and me to do another one together. And we were talking about differences in locations, equipment, air support, you know, all the different things, terrain, all that. So for me, it's been a really good thing getting back in touch with some of these guys. Another guy that I spent a couple hours on the phone with last week, I didn't know him, but he was best friends with one of my roommates who was killed. And over the years, I became aware of that through a personal civilian friend of my buddy's. And we hooked up last month or two, and so we're talking regularly now. So it's a good thing.
Well, it's how you and I met. I mean, Jason introduced me to you, and I've been interviewing, of course, Marines mainly, and I wanted to interview whoever's willing to talk. And
you wanted to hear somebody that had some real stories, you know. And I'm pretty vocal about the fact that I'm not interested in benefiting personally from telling these stories, or, you know, I feel very humbled that there's so much interest in hearing the stories. Over the years, especially once it declassified, I've probably got every book that's come out. And you know, I made a career. I was a cop for a few years, and then I made a career with the telephone company, and I retired in 2003. And I'm a saddle maker and leather worker and all that. And in 2012, I think my proudest moment, I started teaching. The commanding general at Fort Leonard Wood called me, said, would you be in? He read a newspaper article about me doing saddle making, leather work and all that. He said, would you be interested in teaching a leather working class for the wounded soldiers? I said, hell yeah. And he says, I'll have the colonel in charge of the hospital call you tomorrow. So he called me, and right away, we got started. I had some supporters that provided me with supplies and what have you. And my class became so popular that people were telling the commanding general that they were getting more benefit out of my class than some of the rehab classes they were being sent to. That didn't go over real well, but at the same time, the general wanted to see what the hell's this guy doing. And he came to one of my classes, and he wanted to make a holster for one of his pistols. He never did follow through, but you know. But in 2014, I was told I had to go to this luncheon, and I went. I didn't want to go, and they're like, "No, you have to go." And I said, "No, I have class today." You know, I go to lunch with some of my students, and I'd have anywhere from 20 to 30 students in my class. And they kept going back and forth. You have to go to this thing. And finally they said, look, there's going to be a special program and you have to go because it involves you. So I went and had the lunch and all that stuff. And I ended up being awarded the President's Silver Medal for my service with the vets. And okay, what do I have? I've got a letter from the White House out in the wall in my workshop, and the medal is about the size. It's about the size of a nickel. You'd think, coming from the president, you'd think it'd be something special, you know, like a military medal or whatever. It's a little medal, so I wear it on my hat. But it's from the president. You know, how many people have a medal from the president?
That's true.
So I mean, that, and for me, one of my soldiers was a master sergeant, and he lived about an hour from the fort. So I'm a half hour one way, and he's an hour the other side of the fort. Well, when he got out of the Army, he started his own leatherworking business, and we still belong to a group of leather workers. And in fact, he was just in my house Friday, spent the day working on a saddle. And so we still, and that was my big success story with that program. I mean, I still, right now, I have, if I count him as a student, I've got 3 disabled vets that come to my house and do leather work. So that's my passion now.